Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to yet another of our Manchester sessions. It's absolutely brilliant to have you here. I know you're busy people, and we're just giving a little bit of time for people to join the session before we start. As always, please make sure that if you have any questions for our guest speaker today, you use the Q&A as always to put your questions in, and we will be picking those questions up towards the end of the session. And as always, you are free to use the chat and pass your messages to us and to others, and have a catch up as usual. Excuse me. It's been a busy day for webinars and sessions. The professional development team at IOSH have been running a good session on CPD today, which I was fortunate to be able to join. And Merseyside have just completed a legal update, which I'm sure one or two of you will have joined us from. Anyway, today, Manchester's branch has managed to secure a fantastic speaker for you. Paul Bizzell is the Ops Director of RyderMarsh OCAID. He's joined us today from sunny Oxfordshire, and he's going to be talking to us about leading indicators. So welcome, Paul. Thank you on behalf of the branch, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, thanks everybody for joining. And as Chris says, basically what we're going to do today is take a tour through the art and the science, and it is both, of designing and interpreting some leading indicators. This may be a little bit different to the sort of seminar or webinar you're used to, because I'm going to do a little bit of sort of esoteric theory first, and then get increasingly practical towards the end. Conscious of some of you will want this for CPD, so there's some very practical stuff in there that makes sure you can do that. I've really got 4 aims today, and if I can achieve all of these, I think it'll be 45 minutes well spent. The first one is to sort of clarify the terms and the concepts behind the subject. There are different terms and there's an awful lot of confusion out there, but the big one that I want to talk about is actually there is a specific way of thinking that you need to really understand the difference between lagging and leading indicators, and to use them in the most effective way. So we will look at what's the appropriate use of each, where and when should you actually use each, because it's not a case of either one or the other. Each has its place. I'll take you through some of the design principles. So, for example, what makes a good indicator, because it's very easy to put some indicators in that are practically meaningless. But I'll give you a little 5-point design clue on what makes a good indicator. And as I said before, really the one thing that I really want to try and exemplify today is how you can actually think in a leading style. And I always say this is a little bit like learning a foreign language. Those of you that have done it, I certainly went through 3 distinct stages. The very first one was learning a little bit of the vocabulary, so we'll do that early on. The second one then is learning a little bit of grammar, so how do you technically construct a sentence? And that kind of allows people to think in their native language and translate into the foreign language. But you don't really master that foreign language. I did a little bit of French in school, and it takes me about 3 days when I go and visit my sister at a holiday home in France, if I could. The first day I pretty much say nothing. The second day it's a little bit of pointing. And then on the third day, a wonderful thing happens. I open my mouth and something comes out in French. And I've had that thought in French and I've spoken in French. And that's really where you need to get to have a good conversation and do good design of a leading indicator, because there are some quite confusing concepts around. And once you've got it and you can think in that way, you'll be off and you'll be flying. So let's start off with an actual definition. There are an awful lot of definitions of leading indicators out there. The very first thing I want to do then is basically call out the elephant in the room. There are lots of articles out there on the internet, and believe me, I've checked over the last couple of weeks. Some of them are actually just plain wrong. They might be using some of the right vocabulary, but their concepts behind it are misleading at best. So I don't want to go into too much detail on this slide, but a good understanding of the concept does really need that understanding and the way of thinking. So if I can give you that today, pretty much job done. So try and do a little bit of clarification then. I'm hoping that most of you are either drivers, or at least you've understand you've sat in the front seat of a car and you understand the principles of driving. But what I want to do now is to get you to imagine that you're sitting in the front seat of the car and you're the driver, and this is what you see in front of you. It's another car, and you're both moving along in an orderly fashion, and what you see then on the car in front is this. All of a sudden an amber flashing light starts on the right hand side of the car in front of you. Now the question I've got, as the driver of the car behind, how would you react to seeing that amber flashing light? What would you do? Now the normal sort of replies I get to that, if I'm doing this in the classroom, is, well, we'd slow down, or we'd prepare to brake or move left. Good answers. The one thing that I can pretty much guarantee you won't do when you see that amber flashing light is count how often it's flashing. And that's why that's called a traffic indicator and not a traffic measurer. What it actually means, and that I've taken this text directly from the highway code, I intend to move out to the right or turn right. My highlights on emboldening and italicizing of the word intend, but that introduces the first concept that's really crucial thinking about leading indicators. It's an intention. There's a little bit of uncertainty in there. There is the possibility that what it's intending to happen actually won't happen. So let me see what we can actually say then about that concept of uncertainty. Let's try and give a better definition. So what we've got, this definition I've taken from one of the better publications out there about leading indicators. It's the NSC Campbell Institute Expert Panel document, a standard for measuring or an implementation guide to leading indicators. Now, that guide was put together, I think it was published about 2 or 3 years ago. It's a PDF, you can download it from the Campbell Institute Expert Panel from their website. And just to warn you, I have actually changed a couple of words in it from their definition. It took an expert panel, I think, 3 years to come up with it, and then I fiddled with it. They actually said a predictive measure rather than a metric. I've used the word metric, and I've taken the definition from dictionary.com. And again, there are many definitions of metric out there, but this is the one that I like. A standard for measuring or evaluating something, especially one that uses figures or statistics. The reason I like that definition, and I've changed the word from measurement, is for clarity. It's about evaluating. Not all evaluations are numeric, and that's another key concept surrounding a leading indicator. The other thing that I've just changed slightly, that's the other thing in orange, is a SHEQ, check management system. The Americans tend to use EHS, and my point is that, well, it actually applies equally well to quality as it does to well-being, health and environment. So you could actually even say a system, because you could use this for financial systems as well. Okay, so 2 concepts then, but there's a good definition, and that for those of you that are interested in the CPD, that's a very usable one, I think. I want to make a sort of some deeper comparisons though, between what are traditional measurements which the most management systems are absolutely full of, and indicators, because there are an awful lot of subtle differences between what I would call a measurement and what I hope to call an indicator. The first one is the output focus. Measurements tend to focus on things that have already happened, past tense. They're things that you can count, things that have happened, or sometimes things that are happening in real time. Indicators, on the other hand, there's an input focus to them. It's about what are we going to be doing. So again, you've got that sort of forward-looking thing. So past or instantaneous measurements, in other words, lagging, and future, most of the time for indicators. It is actually technically possible to have a lagging indicator, but they're not so common, and I don't want to cloud it too much by talking too much about them. But just for perfection, mostly future, mostly leading. Measurements tend to be counts, very numeric, but a forecast is a hypothesis. This is what we think we're going to happen. If I take you back to the car example, what the indicator means is I intend to move right, to the right, or turn right. Well, yes, but what if the driver of that car wasn't familiar with the car? It was a pool car or a hire car or their partner's car or something, and the stalks were the other way around. So that when they pushed the right-hand stalk down, expecting the indicator to turn right, it actually washed the windscreen. The switches were around the wrong way. So it's a hypothesis. The hypothesis is if I push the lever down on the right-hand side, it'll indicate that I'm turning right. Not always. So counts, because they've happened, high degree of certainty. Forecasts, hypotheses, predictions, there's a degree of uncertainty in there. So measurements tend to be exact and typically quantitative. Lots of indicators. They're about a probability or a range, between this and this, particularly when you get into statistics, and they can be qualitative. Measurement requires data and facts. The other thing about indicators is, yes, you need some data, and it's nice if you've got some facts, but it absolutely requires insight. Now, this is absolutely crucial, because the only person that can actually give insight is somebody that understands the situation, understands the context, understands the culture, if you like, of where the data is actually being collected. Now, that's kind of where you come in, because the right person to do some kind of insight into an organization is somebody who really knows it. It's also why an external consultant, if they come in and say, use these indicators, without actually familiarizing themselves with the conditions, the prevailing conditions, and understanding a little bit about how the site works, they're not likely to be particularly relevant. So it does require your insight. There is a huge corollary to this, and that is how measurements and indicators are regarded by managers and other people in the organization. Because of all of the characteristics I've got in the left-hand columns, managers tend to like and accept measurements. On the other hand, because of the uncertainty and the certain amount of fluffiness around the outside of some indicators, managers can often be suspicious and dislike them. So I'll talk a little bit about later on about what you might do about that and how you actually might get the message across. Okay, so that's your leading and your lagging. What I do want to do is to talk a little bit about where do you actually focus. Well, there's two views of this. Let me give you the typical sort of process view, if you like. The process sits there in the middle. It's a sort of black box. And typically when you're doing process diagrams, you've got an input to the process. The process does something, transforms the input, and you get an output. And the output will either be a product or a service or perhaps an intermediate. You can see from the arrows there, it's very simple. Leading indicators tend to look at the input side of a process. Your lagging indicators are counting what's come out of the process. So again, we've got that whole sort of concept of proactivity versus reactivity. The other one, which I think is quite interesting, is what I call the Swiss cheese view of this. You'll be familiar with the Swiss cheese model. Basically, what this is saying is that you've got lots of control measures in your system, barriers between a hazard and the hazard becoming active and causing harm. And because we're human and we're not perfect, the controls that we've designed have got little holes in them. And because as human beings, we're not consistent, we don't quite do the same thing on the same day in the same way every time. The holes in the cheese tend to move around a little bit and open and close on different days. And what Swiss cheese says basically is that on the day that all of those holes line up on your various levels of control measure, of barrier, all have each got a hole in them, the hazard becomes harm. Now, the other way of looking at leading and lagging indicators is your lagging indicators tend to respond to the detection of a hole. Whereas what we're doing with the leading indicators is trying to test the integrity of the controls themselves and hence the system. So what I'm talking about really here is when you're doing accident investigations, yes, you're picking up some data, yes, you need to think about it, but you're counting the things that have already gone wrong. When you've got a really good leading indicator, it's saying, hang on a minute here, I'm getting a little concerned that there's a probability that something's going to go wrong here because the system has got some kind of defect in it. Okay. And again, back to the Campbell Institute, they come up with quite a three-part characterization, which I think is quite helpful. They say that the indicators can basically be used in different places. There's operations-based indicators, and they're the ones that are relevant to the functioning of an organization's processes, its plant, its machinery, and they can differ from site to site as well. Now, these ones tend to be sort of production-based, and as a check professional, you may not get involved in too many of these, but all of the principles that we're talking about today apply to these as well. The other two that they quite helpfully characterize, the first one is systems-based leading indicators. More often than that, you will be involved with these. It's about the integrity, how well is the indicator, is the system actually working? So you're looking at the various components of a check system, and are they there, are they working, so on and so forth. So that is part of your day-to-day thing. The third one that they introduce, and this is where my company's speciality tends to come in, it's looking at the behavior-based leading indicators. Now, these are indicators that measure the behavior or actions of individuals. Interesting that Campbell used the word measure there. What you do with those measurements once you've got them, I'll talk about a little bit later on, because that's absolutely crucial. That's part of the thinking. We do, though, with the behavior-based leading indicators, this is where we get more into the culture. And there's the chance to use a lot more non-numeric indicators. In our company, we call these cultural clues. Just to give you a little one-off of how this can help when you're actually tuned in. This is a photograph that one of my principal consultants, Matthew Strong, took when he visited a potential customer. As he rolled up to the front door, he noticed the broom propped against it. And it was just a little cultural clue that was a bit odd. Why is there a broom leaning against the door? And it gave him the chance to ask that as he signed in at security and went through all of the normal checks and balances signing in. He just sort of casually asked, what's with the broom leaning against the door? And he got a fantastic response. And the response from the person behind the desk, oh, don't talk to me about the broom. We just had a new security system installed. And basically, when I knock off at 5:30, I've got the button under the desk here to let people out of the door. So technically, I can't go home until everybody else has, but I knock off at 5:30. So what has to happen at 5:30 as I go, I prop the door open with the broom. Now, wonderful little anecdote, and straight away you've got a little cultural clue, a little indicator that there's a flaw in the system there somewhere, because the security is great from 8 o'clock in the morning to 5:30 at night, and then a little bit more lax once the broom's been put on the door. So I think that's a wonderful little anecdote that just illustrates how non-numeric indicators are absolutely crucial to cluing into what's really going on with the integrity of the system. Okay, so a little bit more on the characteristics of indicators then. Again, 3 different types here. There's the standard sort of numerical ones, what some people call quantitative ones. The non-numeric, we tend to talk about qualitative, so we're talking about the qualities of the system rather than the iterations of it. And there are, within this and within the culture thing, again, 3 different types of cultural indicators that we tend to work with. The behavioural ones, behaviour-based safety, if you like. There's been an awful lot done on that over the years. But Artefacts 2, I've just shown you an artifact, a broom being used as an indicator. And then that one in the middle there, language. Now, you can tell an awful lot about the integrity of a system, about the way that people talk about safety. So, for example, when the conversations about safety happen, before a job starts or after something's gone wrong, who starts the conversation? Is it management talking down to the staff, or is it staff asking questions? So, what's the direction of communication? And these are sort of qualitative aspects of a safety management system, and you can, sort of things you can do some counts about, and the ratio of discussions that happen before an accident to the ones that happen after an accident will probably tell you something about how secure your system actually is likely to be. Very predictive. There is technically a 4th one, a 4th part of culture, which is beliefs, but they change very slowly, so we don't tend to pick up indicators on those. They tend to be a different type, which is the 3rd type, and that's a presence or an absence of a particular indicator. Some people call these critical success factors. Often the early part of any change program will be the need to establish them. So, for example, if you're implementing an ISO management system, one of the criteria for passing certification is that you've got a working internal audit system. So if there's no internal audit system, or if there is, but actually it isn't being run, that's an indicator that you're not going to pass the certification audit. And it's also an indicator that you've got a weakness there in the system. Right, okay. So I promised you in the title we talk a little bit about designing leading indicators. And basically there is a 3-step process to this. The first one basically, and this is crucial, you need to know what the goal is. Now, the thing about goals in management systems, as opposed to targets, which can be SMART and the acronym holds, the goal tends to be a little bit more aspirational and is seldom measurable. So one of the things that you really can use indicators for is developing something that gives you an indication whether the goal in the future is likely to be hit. Now, this actually often requires you doing something differently. So we're going to be talking about change, and I'll give you a few slides on behavior change, just as a little taster and a heads up. But what you need to do as the second step is define the activities that are key to reaching the goal. And again, that's my emphasis, because there may be lots of activities, but which are the ones that are the really big hitters, which are going to make the big difference. And leading indicators are pretty much always about some kind of behavior or some kind of activity, often a new one, or doing something differently. So that's a good place to be actually looking when you're designing leading indicators. Let's look at what activities need to happen and how these activities need to happen in order to get where it is that we're trying to get to. At that point, you'll try to define a metric relating to each of those key activities. Not all of the activities. Confine yourself to the key ones, you know, the old Pareto analysis, the 80-20 rule. If you look at about 20% of them, you'll cover 80% of the likelihood. Now, I also promised you that I'd talk to you a little bit about designing good leading indicators. And to do that, I've come up with a little acronym. What you are actually after is MEATY leading indicators. Again, this is drawing on the work from the Campbell Institute, but I think I've improved it slightly and made it a little bit snappier and a little easier to comprehend. So what does the acronym stand for then? Well, meaningful. The first rule of this is you've got to be dealing with something that is real, and it's got some kind of predictive power that helps you identify so that you can eliminate or at least control some kind of risk. Again, that word risk is creeping in there, and you know, risk is all about, one part of risk is all about probability and as well as the potential harm. The second one, and again, this is really important, is that whatever you're measuring has got to be easy to communicate. If you're just trying to use leading indicators in splendid isolation, you're going to know what's going to happen, but you've kind of, that's not awful lot of use unless you can influence other people to do things differently as a result of the of what the indicator is actually telling you. So it needs to be easy to communicate. So pick something that's real, something that's common, and pretty much easy to talk about, both at management level, because you've got to explain the consequences, but at the operational level, because you've got to get people doing what it is that needs to be done. The third one, achievable. So you can have the most intricate design of an indicator, but if it's difficult to measure, or there's a huge degree of uncertainty about the measure, it's not really going to be useful. So I've marked that one down as achievable. And again, drawing on you know, the idea of the SMART principle, it's also got to be timely. You've got to be able to collect your data pretty much in real time, so that it's up to date. There's no use, you know, having a huge lag between collecting the data and then being able to analyze it and then interpret it, because the whole point about this and the whole point about leading indicators is it's giving you the ammunition to do something proactively to eliminate or control a risk. So it's got to be, you know, pretty much current data that you're dealing with. And then the last one, it really does need to be something that you can control. You know, once the data's been collected, it's something you can take action to change if necessary. So something that's within your span of authority is an awful lot more meaty than something that's a little bit nebulous, and you've got to get 17 different people to agree to before a change will happen. You've lost the timeliness if part of it, if that happens. Hope that makes sense. I promised you a little bit about behavior. So 3 things you need to know about behavior. The first one is the basic model. This is called the TBO model, sometimes called the ABC model, but it's the same thing. And basically what the diagram there is trying to show you is that there are 3 things. There is a trigger, which is something that prompts a behavior. There's the behavior itself. And then there's the outcome, which is what we get as a result of the behavior. The grey arrow there, of course, is showing that this is a great big feedback loop. So the first time that you go around the loop, you get an outcome, and that outcome then becomes, or the memory of the outcome becomes an expectation, which is part of a trigger to the behavior the next time around the loop. What's a little bit less obvious, and this was originally done by a guy called B.F. Skinner, if you want to go and read some more background on this. You would think that what dominates a behavior is actually the trigger, just by the way that diagram's done. What the psychologists have spent an awful lot of time understanding and can explain to us is that actually what really governs the behavior is the actor's expectation of the outcome. So if you are going to be designing leading indicators and you do want to be changing people's behavior, what you've got to be very cognizant of is what are the possible outcomes of every behavior and what's the likelihood of them. Now, I can give you some good examples of how Artefacts is used as triggers and indicators. One that, again, I'll take it from the world of driving because that's pretty ubiquitous. The one we're all familiar with is the speed camera ahead sign. So it's a really interesting one because we've talked about uncertainty. How often do you see one of those signs and there actually is no camera? But the purpose of the sign, of course, is to trigger a particular behavior, which is get the motorist to slow down. And of course, the other one that's associated with this is the camera itself. And that's basically there as another indicator that if you don't slow down, there will be consequences. So you've kind of got two slightly similar things there, but actually one is a much stronger indicator perhaps than the other one actually is, based on your knowledge and your numbers of times you've been around that loop as a driver, see the trigger, slow down, oh, there's no camera. And so at some point you become conditioned to sort of downplay the significance of the first trigger and wait for the second one. Okay, second little thing about behavior. When we're thinking about what are the positive outcomes, and again, I'm talking about exceeding the speed limit here, there are three things that we tend to take in mind when we're evaluating how strong a particular indicator or a particular trigger actually is. The first one is how soon, certain, and positive it is versus how delayed, uncertain, and negative. Now, when we do this exercise in class, we say, what are the consequences of speeding? Because it's a safety related thing, most of the time, the ones there in red are the ones that actually sort of come up. Well, we could crash and die, we could kill somebody else, we get points, we have fine, points on our license, and so on, have to attend a speed awareness course, something like that. Now, the thing about those is they are broadly delayed, uncertain, and negative. It's not certain that you're going to crash. Some would say it's very unlikely you're going to have a crash. Certainly negative, but you're probably not going to crash or die or kill someone else or get a points and fine at the point that you see that first sign. You might when you see the camera, but even then it's only when you've gone past the camera. So there's a delay in it. And what we know is that triggers that are delayed, uncertain, and negative are incredibly weak. So when you dig a little bit deeper into this, what you'll find is that the real consequences that people are looking at is, well, if I'm speeding, I want to get there faster. It's fun, it's exhilarating, or I'm going to get to the meeting on time, all of which is certain and positive. So basically, when you're designing these little indicators, you need to think about what is it that's actually motivating people. On the outcome side, just a few little points here. The outcomes always follow a behavior, and the outcome determines whether the behavior has been successful for the performer. And the trap we can fall into is designing systems where we know what success is for us as the system operator, but not necessarily as the actor in the system. And just a little reminder of what I said before, it's actually the outcomes that drive behavior. So if people speed, get to the meeting on time, don't get any points on their license, don't have a crash, they're more likely to speed again next time. And the crucial thing about this is the effect of an outcome is actually determined by the individual that's doing the particular behavior. Right back to an earlier slide, this is where your insight comes in. A little bit of knowing about what's going on with your people, knowing your people and understanding what they're getting out of a particular behavior or a particular process goes a long way to designing a good indicator. So we've done the design. Next little thing I want to walk you through is the 3 steps to actually creating one. So the first one is assess the activity. So take a look at the input to the process of achieving the goal. collect some data, monitor the trends, and ask yourself the question: is the change desirable or undesirable? And the other thing that you can do at that point is use the data to predict. So once you've designed it, 3 steps, and then taken these 3 steps and test the activity, monitored the trends, and then made a prediction, at that point, and at that point only, you actually have a leading indicator. So, types of prediction. If you've got a series of data rather than a single data point, then you can start to do some trend analysis and extrapolation, series of data points, and make a forecast. COVID is a perfect example of this. We're right in the middle of it. One of the things that they're looking at is what's the R number. So what's the likelihood of, is it over 1 and we've got an increasing number of infections, or is it under 1, which means that in the coming weeks we'll have a decreased number of infections. So, but to do that, you do need a series of data points. If you gather the number of infections over a period of time, you can graph it, extrapolate it, calculate the R number, and then use that R number to forward forecast. All of this, however, requires some assumptions. And again, this is where your insight comes in, because only somebody who really knows the system can make good assumptions. Going back to the COVID one of the things you've got to look at is the population that we're actually looking at, are they all acting in the same way? And we've got evidence emerging now that 20 to 29-year-olds are acting in a different way to the rest of the population. Who would have known? Well, perhaps somebody who understood the psychology of human behavior might have been able to say that and feed that into the equation a little bit earlier on than now in real time. The other type of prediction is what we call inference. And I'm not going to go into this too deeply beyond saying there are technically 3 different types of inference: deduction, induction, and abduction. I haven't got time to go too deeply into that today, but do go away and look up the difference between it. Deduction is basically if this, then that. And it's the sort of thing that you tend to use in very tight fixed systems. Induction and abduction are the ones where you're actually looking at what you know and what you can infer, and again using your insight in order to make some kind of inference. The third type of prediction, and again, I'd love to go into this in more detail, but it would take a whole day course to do it rather than a 45-minute one. Sampling and statistical analysis. This could be quite frightening to some people. Statistics is not everybody's cup of tea. The good news is, if you concentrate on collecting the data, you can always find somebody who really enjoys a good spreadsheet, and then they're having fun and you're having fun, and you don't necessarily need to do the statistics yourself. Remember that actually sampling is actually quite powerful. Probably the type of sampling that you're most familiar with, whether you realize it or not, is auditing. Because when you're auditing, you don't look at every instance or every process or every procedure. What you tend to do is to look at a sample of them over time, and that will give you some kind of clue about the integrity of your system. So motivating change, again, whether this is personal for you, you can use this for yourself, or whether you're trying to use this for the organization, basically a 3-step process again. First of all, find the why, find the root cause. And for those of you who are doing any incident investigation or accident investigation, just remember the root cause is never ever a behavior. You can always ask, why did they do that? So there's maybe another 5 whys if you got to the point of behavior. Having done that, measure the activity. And the reason that we're looking at activity, again, it's the soon, certain, and positive. You'll get the result from the activity, even though you haven't necessarily reached the goal yet. But measuring the activity and reporting it back is quite a motivator to people, because they can see that they're taking the steps, so they're 60% of the way there or whatever. And the third one, again, is actually having realistic goals. So if you've got a big goal, it's often useful to break it down into milestones because again, you've got that shorter term success, and there's nothing that motivates like success. So, how do we actually use these leading indicators? Well, this is kind of where science and art tend to meet. So at this point, we've got a model, we've got some data, we've got a prediction, and we've got a chance to intervene. And this is where the rubber meets the road. The question here is, do you have control? Yeah, you know, was it in the MEATY indicator? Did you have that why? If you have, great. Use your authority. Make the changes you need to make, but do remember to do them in a sort of selling way rather than the telling way. There's a little asterisk there because I'm more than happy to come and give you another webinar about how to do that well at a future date. If you haven't got control, have you got at least influence? Well, that's great. If you have got some kind of influence, then you're into using persuasion and you're back to the sell again, because you can't tell them to do something, you do have to sell it. Enough said on that one. Now, I promised you that I'd give you a whole bunch of potential metrics, and I'm using the word very carefully, potential safety-related metrics. It will be up to you to convert these into leading indicators, because I can't possibly tell you what your goal actually is. That you'll have to do that for yourself. But this is where we can start from. Risk assessments. Yeah. So a sort of leading indicator we can have about there is, what are the percentage that are up to date? That will tell you something about the integrity of your system. Audits, whole bunch of things we can do with audits. How many were completed to schedule? How many had de minimis findings? With actions closed out effectively by an agreed time. So we're now getting into the sort of qualitative area. And what's your mean time to close out actions? Now, one of the things that you can do is look at this as a time series. So you can ask yourself, are our audits getting sharper or are our audits getting slacker? And if the mean time to close out actions is going up, that's an indicator that there's things you've identified those holes in the Swiss cheese, but there's more opportunity for them to become active and let the harm through, let the hazard through to harm. A lot of people sort of talk about observations of behaviours, and again, you know, that's just another type of audit. So pretty much everything that we said above kind of works. The language might be slightly different. So what number completed to schedule, what percentage safe, is there an acceptable level, or what's the overall participation? How many people are bought into this and they're actually going out and doing their observations? Some more here around the system itself. Take a look at your actual SHAC meetings, whatever type you might have. How often are they? Is that frequency increasing or decreasing? How often are they getting cancelled or postponed? Is that happening more often or less often? What about the attendance? Not just the numbers, but who's represented? Have you got the whole of the organisation there? What's the seniority of people who are attending? Are people all of a sudden ducking out of the meeting and sending a substitute? Well, you know, one of their staff as a substitute. Little indicators that maybe there's the integrity of the system is beginning to decline. And here's a really good one. How many items are carried forward from the previous meeting? You know, in other words, is your action closeout not happening? Or are people, I could add another one to that actually. How long before this meeting did the action get closed out? That's a really nice one that we've used a couple of times with a couple of customers. Now, I was talking about near misses and behavioural observations, and a lot of people actually talk about behavioural observations as being a really good leading indicator. But, and this is a little bit of a trick question, how can it be a leading indicator if you're making observations of what people are actually doing and you're collecting data about events that have actually happened? How can that be a leading indicator? Well, the answer to the question is it lagging or is it leading? And I said it was a little bit of a trick question. It can actually be both or either. It depends whether or not they're being used appropriately. If you read the management standards, whether it's quality or environment or safety, they will all say that basically there are two types of action: corrective action and preventative action. So if you're doing behavioral observations and you're picking up that people are doing something inappropriately, for example, bending their back when they're doing manual handling, if you are merely doing the corrective action, which is basically stepping in and stopping them doing it on a case-by-case basis, then actually what you've got is a lagging indicator, even though it's behavior. If, however, what you're looking at is things like the trend of the trend over time of the percentage of lists that are carried out correctly, then it's actually can be a leading indicator. And the way that you change behavioral data from corrective into preventative is actually looking at aggregating it. What are not the individual incidents of somebody lifting something incorrectly, but what are the percentage of lifts that are actually being done correctly, and is that increasing or decreasing? That's where your leading indicator comes from essentially the same behavior. It's that aggregating it up and looking at the trend. So there's a couple of sort of potential leading indicators. This is actually one that you can go and have a look at. Go back and take a look at your last few audits or your last few incident investigations and have a look at the actions. How many of those actions were actually corrective actions, fixing a hole in the slice of cheese, Swiss cheese, or how many of them were preventative? And how were they actually looking at something that was actually changing something around the activities, rather than putting simply putting another control measure in place? So in other words, what percentage of actions are adding to the classic safety system? Are you putting up a sign, retraining people, writing another procedure, redoing a risk assessment? That's a corrective action. Yeah, what we're actually looking at is what's the root cause of this, and why are people doing this, and what's in it for them, and doing a proper sort of behavioural root cause analysis on it. Just a couple more slides before we get through to the questions. I've got potential safety related on near miss reports. So nice sort of employee safety suggestions. Quite a lot of organisations have that, but unless you're actually looking at them, completing them, and feeding back to people what's been done about it, what's the point in actually having the near miss reports in the first place? What you can also look at is, are we getting repeats of the same one, or is the trend moving on to talking about something new? If it is, that's an indicator that people have stopped worrying about what it was that was bothering them in the first place. When you do the root cause analysis of it, are you coming up with the same root cause, or are you coming up with a different root cause? So, and again, the usual ones about what actions were closed out by an agreed time, and what's the mean time to close out action. So you've got those classic ones coming in there again. And then from your classic health and safety system, injuries. Have you got clusters around a particular body part, for example? Have you got illnesses? Is your time off work increasing? That's an indicator somewhere that you might have too many stressors in the system. Might be time to do a stress risk analysis. Are you seeing an abundance of environmental problems? Maybe actually there's something not so much with the safety system, but with the environmental one. So on and so on. But this is so much to do with your data and your system and your insight. We can come and talk to you about all of these, but typical consultant, we need to borrow your watch in order to be able to tell you the time and charge you for it, of course. And then the last one, incident investigations. And one of the things that you can actually look at here is the style of them. I've talked an awful lot here about the style in which things are done, and the quantitative part of it as being a really good indicator. So I just want to leave you with one, particularly in safety training, but you can widen it out to the whole of safety training. So you can actually look at what's the availability of the safety training. What's the percentage of people's specific tickets, like truck driving or something? What's the percentage of those that are up to date? How often are we getting cancellations and postponements there? When we put on a course, does everybody turn up, or are people sort of sending last minute things saying, terribly sorry, I can't come, there's a production rush on? Little indicators there that you can actually use. But don't forget to look at some of the quality of the training as well. And just to really, as the last slide, to bring in this concept of, it's really about the style of thinking when you're really getting to be leading. There are some questions you can actually ask about the style of the training that's being given, and you can do some opinion surveys on this. So on the timing, yeah, is it remedial? Oh dear, we've had an accident, we better retrain people to make sure it doesn't happen again, or is it before people are set to work in the first place? So is it really proactive? And the style of it, is it instruction, do this, 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 and this, or is it actually proper learning? Do people do people take it on board and participate in it? Is it a lecture, or is it a seminar? Different styles of it. You can give a lecture and people can sit there absolutely stony faced for 40 minutes, not necessarily actually listen. If it's more of a seminar style, that's more participative. You're asking questions, you're inviting feedback. Different style again. Is this actually training for the sake of it, or actually is it some kind of discovery? Are people sort of learning something new, and do they view it as indoctrination, or do they view it as enlightenment? What's the participants' view of it? How do you actually talk about the attendees? Are they the recipients of training, which is a very transactional thing, or are they participants in it, which is a more transformational thing? Are they called a trainee, or are they actually called a candidate? Is there some kind of attainment at the end of it? And at the end of it, do they get a certificate that says they have attended, job done, process orientated, or is there some kind of test to show that they've taken the subject matter on board, and actually there's a degree of competency? And then the last one, of course, and this is the really subjective one, what's the attendee's view? Yeah, is it an ordeal that they have to go through in order to tick a box, or actually is it a pleasure for them to be there because the training, the style is fun and they enjoy it? So it's not just a duty to be there, but they actually arrive with a desire to learn. And right at the end of it, is it event completed, or actually is it the application about to start? So I guess actually I could say that's the ultimate acid test of whether this webinar has been effective or not. You tick the box and say, okay, that's the webinar over, or you go, there's some stuff in there. I'm going to go back to my workplace and I'm going to sort of think about how I can put this to use. So there we go. That's basically the end of this section of the webinar.
Thank you very much, Paul. We've got a few questions. We have a bit of time taking us up to 4 o'clock. We will try our best to get through as many as we can. But Paul, if you just want to share your screen again with your contact details.
Oh, okay.
I'm sure if I don't get to all these questions, if anybody has any burning questions, I'm sure you'd be happy to pick them up with your contacts at the end.
Yeah, there's an inquiry form on the website, or all of our email addresses are first name dot last name at rmocade.com or ocaid.com.
Okay. We've got a few minutes. So Jeff Airy was the first in with a question, and he says, if we let people know we are monitoring leading indicators, is it possible this temporarily incentivizes positive behaviour, but these disappear in the absence of monitoring later?
The short answer to the question is yes. There's some very good science that basically says what gets measured gets done. And if you let people know that you're actually measuring it, monitoring it, then you will normally get a positive blip in desired behaviour. What tends to happen over time is that people get used to it, and whatever it was that was driving them to act in a particular way before you started monitoring and let them know, that will become more important than the fact that they're being watched. They'll forget, basically. COVID-19 is probably the best example of this. Part of the issues that we've got now is people have got fed up of all of the controls that have been in place, and they still know that they need to wash their hands. They know they ought to be wearing a mask, but actually they're just not bothering anymore.
Absolutely, and I'm sure that's going to become even more interesting over the next few weeks. Anonymous attendee, how important is it to assemble a team of people from within the organisation to ensure an individual's biases don't affect the determination of the indicators?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. It sort of depends on what it is that you're actually monitoring. Yes, absolutely. What one person thinks is a really big problem isn't necessarily the view of the whole population. However, having said that, the one language indicator that I really sit up and take notice of is if I ever hear casually somebody say, "Oh, crikey, that's an accident waiting to happen," because that actually is a really good soft indicator that somebody has got a significant concern. The very least you need to do is to talk to them and then talk to some other people to see how widely that concern is actually shared.
Okay. A question from our Secretary, Stuart Bailey. How and where can we do the course on interference? Is it online or classroom based?
Sorry, interference?
Yeah.
Inference, you mean?
Inference, sorry.
Yeah. Might be a typo. Give us a call and talk to us. Pretty much everything that we were doing in the classroom, we can do online now out of necessity, and we've had 6 months to think about it.
Okay. Graham Perry asks, is it okay to use near-miss event data as a leading indicator for a potentially more serious event if there is an analysis of control or barrier failure as part of the near-miss investigation?
The answer is yes, if you're using aggregated data as you should be with behavior measurement. It's a lot more tricky if it's about an individual's behavior on an individual occasion. That's more of an HR issue than it is a safety issue, because you're talking potential disciplinary. I'd handle the two things in a very different way. Of course, we all have a duty of care. If we genuinely believe that somebody is doing something that's going to cause injury or even any other kind of harm, then we kind of got a duty to say something to someone.
Yeah. What's your insights on treating observation and accident as leading indicators, operational or behavioural change management in brackets?
It's pretty much the best indicator, because generally what you're trying to do with any kind of culture change program ultimately is to make an improvement in your lagging indicators, your accident rate or your incident rate. Again, there are good behavioural indicators and there are less good behavioural indicators, and this is what I was talking about, where your insight actually comes in. If you're going to take a behavioural system off the shelf, use somebody else's style and a one-off, a rigid approach, it's unlikely that it's going to be appropriate for your organisation. We take quite an extreme view on this, and I can put my hand on my heart and say in 20 years of doing this, we've never done the same implementation twice, because either you're dealing with a different organisation with a different organisational culture, or a different group of people even within the same organisation. The extreme case of this was a food processing plant in Ireland, where they had a completely different set of behaviours and hence culture on one production line for fish than they did for meat pies, which was literally 20 yards away.
Oh, yes. Amanda Fox asks, can you change your monitoring style so people don't become complacent or get used to attending, say, each Monday at 2 o'clock with an internal audit as an example?
Yes, and you should. Variety and change is the lifeblood of any behavioural system. And actually, you probably only want to be looking at one particular issue for about 6 weeks. If you haven't actually collected the data and designed an intervention and checked that it's worked and moved on to the next significant one, it's probably a little slow. But the other thing that's a lifeblood is making sure that you've got succession planning in the people that are actually doing this. The wider you can spread the ownership, the more people buy in. And of course, people will get bored of doing it, but there's, if you introduce new blood, you'll get a new lease of life for it.
Brilliant. Well, sadly, time has caught us up. The hour flies by when you're having fun. Paul, on behalf of the Manchester branch, big thank you for your time today. I'm sure there'll be other questions hitting your emails as we have not got through all the questions in the Q&A. It is appreciated. You give your time, and I did hear you say that you offered to come back in 2021 and do another session for us. It has been duly noted and already commented on by our secretary. So you will be receiving the call.
Okay, and I'll make a promise that I will actually answer all of those questions.
Brilliant, thank you. So with that, we are bang on 4 o'clock. Thank you, Paul. Regards to the guys at RyderMarsh OCAID. And with that, thank you for everybody who attended today. We'll see you on the next one. Watch the LinkedIn and your committee mailer for information, and we'll keep you updated as to what's happening next. Lots of CPD and IPD stuff going on, and so if you're on your career journey, then please keep an eye out for that. We've got lots of exciting things coming up for that. So with that, thanks, Paul. We'll see you again soon. Thank you.
Take care.